Hello. In the last lecture, I talked about how terrorism is distributed worldwide across the entire planet and also across regions of the world. This time, I want to get a little bit more micro level and talk about how terrorism is distributed across countries and cities of the world. And as in the previous lecture, I'm relying on the Global Terrorism Database, a database on worldwide terrorism that's supported by the START Center, which includes data on every known terrorist attack from 1970 to the present. I'll be using this to look at the geographical patterning of terrorism. One way to examine this concentration, of course, is to look at the country level, and that's what I want to turn next. If you look at the first slide, I present the 20 countries with the most terrorist attacks, and these are listed according to their rankings, and I also want to compare the cumulative percentage of total attacks against these countries to their share of countries in the world. For example, if we look at the percentages in row 2, we can see that Iraq and Colombia together account for nearly 15% of all terrorist attacks, despite the fact that they represent less than 1% of the world's total countries. And this is the theme that we will come back to repeatedly in these lectures, that terrorism, like crime, tends to be concentrated in hotspots. It's not randomly distributed. Some areas have a lot of it, a lot of areas have very little of it, and those areas tend to change over time. If we compare percentages of terrorism at the country level, it gives us some indication of just how concentrated modern terrorism really is. According to the slide, for example, the top 20 countries and territories in terms of terrorist attacks account for over 72% of all terrorist attacks, but less than 10% of all countries of the world. You can see this summarized in the figure on row 20. I want to repeat that because it's important. For 72% of all terrorist attacks happen in less than 10% of all countries of the world. Nearly 27% of all terrorist attacks in the GTD took place in just 4 countries: Colombia, Iraq, India, and Peru. This means that less than 2% of the world's countries account for more than a quarter of the world's terrorist attacks. Less than 5% of the world's countries, a total of 10 countries, account for nearly half of the world's terrorist attacks. So what we see here is a remarkable concentration of terrorism in a relatively small number of countries. And this is perhaps the most striking conclusion from this particular lecture on the geospatial distribution of terrorism. Now, to further explore the global distribution of terrorism, I next want to compare the share of terrorist attacks attributed to 5 countries that had the most attacks by decade. If we turn to the next slide, we see the top 5 most active countries for terrorism had about 5,000 total attacks in the 70s, had about 15,000 attacks in the 80s, 10,000 in the 90s, and 16,000 in the first decade of the 21st century. In general, the share of total attacks by decade for the top 5 countries is less concentrated than the results I talked about in the last lecture for regions. In the 1970s, total attacks are especially high in Northern Ireland, which I'm treating here for convenience as a country, and the United States. The most important groups here were the IRA in Northern Ireland, which had over 1,000 attacks, and the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, or the FALN, which had 86 attacks in the United States. The greater importance of the IRA in Northern Ireland compared to the FALN in the United States reflects the much greater diversity of terrorist organizations operating in the U.S. compared to Northern Ireland, which was much more dominated by a single group. By the 1980s, attacks were especially common in El Salvador and Peru. The leading groups in El Salvador were the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, the FMLN, which had over 2,600 attacks in the 1980s, and in Peru, the Shining Path, with over 3,200 attacks. In the 1990s, the country with the largest number of attacks among the top 5 countries for attacks was Colombia, and the most important terrorist group in Colombia during this time was the FARC, which had over 600 attacks. And finally, the largest number of attacks among the top 5 countries for the first decade of the 21st century is Iraq, and the most important terrorist group in Iraq during this period was the Islamic State of Iraq, with 172 attacks, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq with 160 attacks. Interestingly, you can see from the figure the top 5 countries vary a good deal over time. According to the slide, there are only 3 countries that are ranked among the top 5 in 2 consecutive decades. So Peru, which accounts for 29% of attacks among the top 5 in the 1980s and 18% of attacks among the top 5 in the 1990s, and Pakistan, which accounts for 17% of attacks in the top five in the 90s and 19% of attacks among top five in the first decade of the 21st century. And finally, India, which accounts for 18% of attacks in the 1990s and 20% of attacks in the first decade of the 21st century. So no country is among the top five more than twice over the 4 decades examined. So I mentioned earlier, in a perverse way, this is perhaps some of the only good news you'll see about terrorism, that if you happen to be in a country with lots of it at a particular point in time, it's very unlikely that that's still going to be the case a decade or even less than that from this point in time. As in my last lecture, Across Regions, a look at terrorism by country confirms that terrorist attacks are obviously very concentrated in geographic space. Since 1970, nearly 3/4 of all terrorist attacks in the GTD have occurred in just 20 countries. Terrorism-related fatalities are even more concentrated than attacks. Nearly 80% of total fatalities from terrorism since 1970 took place in just 20 countries of the world. Countries with the most attacks generally also have the most fatalities, but there are some exceptions. In general, Burundi, Russia, Rwanda, and Angola are ranked higher on fatalities than attacks. Spain, Chile, South Africa, and Thailand are ranked higher on attacks than fatalities. So this gives you some idea of how terrorism has been distributed around the planet with regard to countries. I want to conclude this lecture by talking about a similar sort of analysis when we look at cities of the world. How are terrorism attacks distributed across the cities of the world? In the next slide, I present the top 20 cities in the world according to population size and total terrorist attacks and fatalities since 1970. I include the population size of cities just to show how it relates to terrorism. This slide shows that city-level terrorist attacks are in fact only weakly related to total populations. In fact, only 4 of the 20 largest cities in the world, this would be Istanbul, Karachi, New York, and Bogota, are among the top 20 terrorist locations in terms of either total attacks or fatalities. And in fact, of these 4 cities, only Karachi is among the top 20 cities in terms of both attacks and fatalities. So you can see there's actually quite a weak relationship at the city level between total population size, terrorist attacks, and fatalities. In addition, Istanbul and Bogota are among the top 20 for total attacks only, and New York City is among the top 20 for total fatalities only. And in fact, New York City, the reason it's in the top 20 for fatalities is almost entirely due to the 4 coordinated attacks of 9/11. If you think about it, we're missing from the top 20 list for either total attacks or fatalities a lot of megacities such as Shanghai, Mumbai, Beijing, Sao Paulo, Seoul, or Moscow. In fact, none of the top 7 cities in terms of total population appear in the top 20 lists for either attacks or fatalities. The slide also shows that compared to the link between city population size and terrorist attacks and fatalities, the link between attacks and fatalities is much stronger. Thus, 10 cities appear on both the high fatality and the high attack list. This includes Baghdad, San Salvador, Karachi, Bogota, Medellin, Guatemala City, Beirut, Mosul, Mogadishu, and Kirkuk. While we can see from these comparisons that the connections between city size and share of terrorist attacks and fatalities is far from perfect, I don't want to go too far down this road. It would be misleading to suggest that there's no connection. So recent population estimates for the 3 smallest cities among the top 20 most attacked still indicate relatively large populations. For example, Jerusalem has an estimated population of 800,000, San Salvador has a population of 550,000, and Belfast a population of approximately 250,000. Belfast also has one of the 3 smallest populations among the top 20 cities in terms of fatalities. However, 2 other cities that are on the top 20 list are even smaller. Tal Afar, a city in northwestern Iraq with only 80,000 inhabitants, and Gaikuro, a region in a remote part of Rwanda that is included in the top 20 list of fatalities because of a single attack which took the lives of over 1,100 people. Let's next consider attacks against the world's cities over time, like we did just a moment ago with countries. In general, the 5 cities with the largest number of attacks have a combined total of about 1,700 attacks in the 1970s, 4,500 attacks in the 1980s, 3,500 attacks in the 1990s, and about 4,000 attacks during the first decade of the 21st century. Belfast is the city with the single largest number of attacks in the 1970s. Lima has the largest number of attacks in the 1980s. Karachi has the largest number of attacks in the 90s. And Baghdad has the largest number of attacks in the first decade of the 21st century. To see how much the locus of terrorism has shifted over time, it's instructive to compare the top 5 cities in the 70s and the first decade of the 21st century. What we see when we do this is that 3 of the 5 top cities in the 1970s are from Western Europe: Belfast, Rome, and Paris, and a 4th is from the United States, New York City. The 5th 1970s top 5 city is San Salvador. In strong contrast, for the first decade of the 21st century, 3 of the top 5 cities are from Iraq: Baghdad, Mosul, and Kirkuk. 1 is from Somalia, Mogadishu, and the other from Pakistan, Quetta. Taken as a whole, then, the results show that the total population of cities is an imperfect predictor of how often they are attacked by terrorists and how many fatalities will result. New York City is probably the best example of a very large city that's experienced a large number of attacks and fatalities. By contrast, huge cities such as Tokyo, Mexico City, and Mumbai have had far fewer attacks and fatalities than might be expected based on their size alone. Also, much smaller cities have sometimes experienced large numbers of attacks. This fits Belfast and Jerusalem, or large numbers of fatalities, which fits Gaikoro and Talafar. As with countries, the cities that are hotspots for terrorist attacks have also changed dramatically over the decades. It's uncommon, as we've just seen, for a city to be in the top 5 in terms of either attacks or fatalities for more than a decade. And there's only a moderate relationship between the rankings of cities in terms of total attacks and fatalities. So let me end with just a few conclusions about the spatial distribution of terrorism at the country and the city level. I began the previous lecture by referencing the ubiquity of modern communication systems and the growing likelihood that you'll hear about a terrorist attack regardless of where it happens. And the amazing thing about this communication and transportation miracle is it not only brings people into our lives through online chat rooms and other kinds of modern technology, but it also means we're very likely to hear about violent, sensational events wherever they happen. And this blanket coverage can easily give you the idea that every place on the planet is equally likely to be affected. But in fact, our analysis suggests that terrorism, like many things in life, including crime, is highly concentrated. It's concentrated by region of the world, concentrated by country, and concentrated by city. 4 regions of the world, and I put here the Middle East, North Africa, South America, South Asia, and Western Europe, and Central America and the Caribbean, jointly account for more than 80% of all terrorist attacks in the GTD since 1970. By contrast, 5 other regions, Russia and the newly independent states, Eastern Europe, East Asia, Australasia and Oceania, and Central Asia jointly account for only 4% of all attacks recorded in the GTD. Geographic concentrations, as we've been seeing, also change over time. Western Europe was the predominant area for attacks in the 70s. Latin America was a predominant location for attacks in the 80s. In the 1990s, it was split pretty evenly between the Middle East, North Africa, South America, and South Asia. And since the beginning of the 21st century, terrorism has been especially common in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. You also see this kind of concentration changing at the country level. About half of all terrorist attacks in the GTD since 1970 have taken place in just 10 countries. And there is much change in these 10 countries over time. So the analysis of country-level terrorism for the past 42 years shows that no country is ever among the top 5 most frequently attacked for more than 2 decades, and most are in this position for only 1 decade. Countries experiencing the most terrorism naturally flow from the regions that do. So it's dominated by West European countries in the 70s, Latin American countries in the 80s, and to some large extent countries from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia after the 1990s. Within countries, we've seen terrorism is also highly concentrated. Thus, for the 1970s, nearly 40% of all terrorist attacks that happened in Northern Ireland, in fact, happened in Belfast. In the 1980s, 32% of all terrorism in Peru happened in Lima. In the 1990s, 66% of all terrorism in Pakistan happened in Karachi. And in the first decade of the 21st century, 44% of all terrorism that happened in Iraq happened in Baghdad. So the conclusion from these two lectures, I hope, is that you've got a much better idea about the global distribution of terrorism at the worldwide, at the regional, at the country, and at the city level. And I want to thank you for your attention.